Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, I'm Michael Elves, and this is Turning Pages, and we're going to peel back the curtain just a bit here and let you know that normally I tape this as live with authors ahead of time. However, we are going straight to air today with my friend Dale Jacobs, whose new book on comics and grief gets its release in his hometown of Windsor tonight. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Thank you for having me.
So, on comics and grief, this is, quite the work here. And I do want to kind of unpack it, but I want to start by talking about quilting. And
Okay.
go with me on this because
Yeah.
it's a thing that you recollect. This book is about your mother and the process of grieving for your mother and a lot of recollections and reflections on your mother. And one of the things you refer to her doing at times is quilting.
Yes.
And in a sense, in reading this book, I think in some ways what you've created is an act of quilting in that,
That's
you've taken a lot of like disparate pieces, and usually like quilting, you take scraps, you take little kind of bits and bobs from different materials and you put them in together into something wholly new that is very much reflective of you and the time that you've put into it. But also quilting is very often considered a craft rather than an art. And there's like a division there that maybe is a false one, in the same way that like academic writing is falsely divided from other writing.
that's really interesting. I think that's true. I hadn't been thinking about quilting for the whole book. I was thinking more about comics as being, sometimes it's called the art of fragments, but it is very much exactly as you're describing, taking those disparate pieces from different places and putting things together that don't normally go together, which, that's what happens a lot of times when you create a quilt. You wouldn't expect them to go together, but they hopefully work when they're brought sort of in conjunction with each other.
So, to kind of back the train up and let folks know, like this book, in some ways, there was a project that could have been this book in an alternate universe that wasn't about grief, but was instead just about comics from the bicentennial year.
Absolutely. And that's, originally this was just a side project as I was finishing something else up. And I got interested in reading all the comics from that year. It started out, I was just going to read the Marvel comics, but I read all the comics, and then I realized in a lot of ways it's a typical year in comics. So I thought that's an interesting way to look at comic books. But it's also a year when the publishers are starting to have trouble selling comic books. There's some of them in a lot of trouble. So I thought it was going to be an academic study of comics. So when I finished reading everything around 2016 or so, I spent a lot of time trying to get the form. I always have to have the form before I start writing. What's the structure that I can build on? And I knew I wanted to focus around the year and do a couple comics per month, but I could never completely get the approach. I knew it had to be interdisciplinary, using book history and media studies, but I couldn't get anything that I was really happy with. And it wasn't until I realized actually 1976 is when I was 10, and this is really about kind of the nostalgia for that time when Mom was still in my life and she was such an important part of my life. So yeah, in an alternate universe, as you put it, this would be a straight academic book.
So in some ways, I guess it's maybe like you break it down month by month, and you choose different comics to released in those months to kind of convey larger themes or explore different avenues. The September one, I think, is the one featuring your presentation.
Yes, yes. It's a conference paper, and that was that conference paper. It's exactly as I presented it. It's the first thing I ever did with this project because it was the bicentennial that I first got interested in, how the different companies were using the bicentennial to sell their comics. So that chapter has the paper as I presented it, but what I did is I interspersed all the things I was thinking as I delivered the paper. So it kind of tries to pull back that veneer that we have of academic writing, that it's all this sort of perfectly put together material when, I'm thinking about who's in the audience. I'm thinking about how do I convert this to an article and all of these things throughout that chapter. It's part of my attempt with this book to do academic work differently.
Now, was that something you were aiming towards regardless of dealing with the grief process? Like, were you looking at like what you could do as an academic writer to either like explore or explode academic writing?
I don't think that part came until the grief component came. When I was thinking about it as a purely academic book, it was going to be interdisciplinary in the way that I, instead of just sort of drawing on my home discipline, which is writing and literacy studies, which I've done before, I really wanted to use methodologies from all different places in comic studies, all the different approaches. But it was still going to be a very traditional academic book, and I think it was bringing in the grief component that started to push me to try to do academic work a bit differently in this case.
You you do kind of insert maybe like an editorial or like an authorial voice above your own at times in this book, kind of commenting on academic writing. And in fact, like, one of the
Yes,
notes I put was, you write you include a paragraph and then you're like, could this paragraph be any more typical of standard academic argumentation?
right.
And you find yourself almost disagreeing with what you previously wrote. And I'm curious about the process. Like, did you write up for a period of time strictly from like an academic perspective and then go back to it as kind of a reader?
No, I was kind of writing it as I went along, and I remember exactly that paragraph you're talking about, and I wrote that paragraph and I reread it and I thought, this doesn't fit in this manuscript. This fits in that other book I was going to write. So then I thought, well, instead of just excising it, why don't I comment on it? So I wanted to bring in that element of self-reflexivity, that kind of like in Wayne's World when they talk to the camera,
Hmm.
so that, in a narrative, it's making the audience aware that it's a constructed object. And I wanted to make my audience aware that this is a constructed object, argument, etc. When you read a piece of academic work, you're not getting lost in the narrative, but you're supposed to get lost in the argument. But I want to pull the reader out of that and not let them get comfortable in that way.
So this isn't you necessarily revisiting your own writing. It's like the like shadow lingering over your shoulder as you write it, thinking about, what you're writing and how you're writing.
Yeah, and I think it's me revisiting the writing of an entire career as well.
And is that in part because the 1776 project, the 1976 project is, thinking back on your life and your life in comics? Like, does
I,
that sort
I
of start the process?
yeah, I think so. It's in part thinking back on mom's life and my life with her, but also I started writing about comics in 2005. So this is almost 20 years of writing about comics in a variety of ways, mostly quite academic. So I think it is that process of looking back on writing about comics as well.
So one of the things you write about, and you talked about this when I asked you about the quilting, is that, like comic panels kind of in some way act as a quilt, right? Like they're not always connected.
Right.
That you write that, modular and fragmented, connected by breaks between sections, as comics are connected by gutters between panels. You're asking the reader to make connections. Are you asking yourself to make connections too? Like, do you first have to challenge yourself in that respect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a process as I wrote the book of making these connections. The comics gave me a way to think about Mom, but Mom also gave me a way to think about the comics. So I was, there's a chapter where I talk about a book called First Issue Special, and it's kind of a tryout book, new characters. And as I knew I wanted to talk about that because that's one of the ways to try to sell the books, but it's this kind of science fiction story. And as I read and had been thinking about Mom and her making clothing and her interest in fashion, I found myself thinking about how the costuming adds to the world building in the story. And without thinking about Mom and making those connections, I wouldn't have talked about costuming in that way. And that led me to all that scholarship on costuming in comics. And that's just one example, I think. But yeah, I had to make a lot of those connections for sure.
So, I mean, you read all these comics from that era. Are you on first pass, like, what are you looking for, or how are you reading it? And then do you go back with a different aim or a different mindset when you read it a second time, trying to make sense of these things or pull them together in ways that you do end up making connections in the book?
Yeah, the first time I read through, I was just taking basic notes, anything that kind of stood out, but I was also looking for kind of genre patterns. I knew that both when I had it as an academic book, but now as well, I knew that I needed representative comics from every genre. There needed to be superhero and war and romance and teen comics and kids comics. I needed something, and I needed something from every publisher, at least every publisher. Um, so it was fairly surface because there were 2,200 comics to read. So I
Mhm.
did take notes on everything, but I was sort of trying to think about what I would use. I had a slate of a bunch of comics I knew I wanted to use. Some of them changed as I went through because they would fit better with what I was trying to say, etc. There was a little bit of movement, but then once I had my set of 36 comics, I went back through, reread them, and then for each chapter, it sort of evolved as I wrote each chapter. I knew I had some things I wanted to say in terms of memoir, and I knew there were some themes I wanted to cover. That sometimes changed as I wrote, but it was that uh, quilting or weaving these ideas together, uh, and it changed with every chapter.
Yeah, so I am curious about kind of like how you land on specific issues or specific books to then give you your jumping off point for each kind of like reflection or recollection. Like, are you inherently making some of these connections as you're reading it to your mom, or are you thinking about your mom separate from that and then searching for things that match up with what you want to talk about in a specific chapter?
I think it happened both ways. So, for example, the January chapter, I talk about Marvel Team Up number 41, which is a comic I remember reading. And it links to, I have a image of mom making lefse, which is a traditional Norwegian dish for Christmas. And I have memories of reading a comic and her making the lefse, and it almost certainly was that comic. So I'm able to use it and weave back and forth. And then the other book I picked for that chapter was Casper Halloween Trick or Treat, which I sort of remember reading, but it would let me talk about some things with Harvey. But then it made me start thinking about Halloween as a kid and the relationship that she had and I had to Halloween, etc. In other cases, there's one chapter, the June chapter is my father passed away 5 years before mom. So the June chapter has a baseball comic and a Western. So Westerns were always around the house for him. So that's a place I knew I could delve into him for a little bit. Um, I knew I needed to tackle a romance comic, but that was also a way I could think about possible other alternative lives for mom with a romance comic, and also with some of the multiverse superhero comics. I start to try to think about who she was before she was our mother, but also what if she had taken a different path in her life.
So you're attempting to kind of go both ways, that you're seeing connections in something you're reading, or you're then looking for connections in
Yeah, I
something
think it,
you're thinking about with your mom.
yeah, I think it happens both ways. And as I said before, sometimes it's the comics that lead to things, to memories and to ways to talk about mom, but sometimes it's mom leading to things to talk about in the comics. So there's also a chapter that I talk about a Spire Christian comic called uh, Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.
Mhm.
And I had written about Spire comics in a previous book because I'm interested in how comics get used to, do things like proselytize. But what I hadn't talked about then was kind of my fraught relationship with religion, because I had um, gone to a Pentecostal church as a kid and a teenager, and mom was very United Church, didn't really particularly like me going to this church. So those kind of evangelical issues that come up in the Spire comics was I could talk about them academically with what's going on in the book, but I could also talk about how mom reacted to those kinds of things. Same with the war comics. When I knew I had to include a war comic, and I did, but I also realized that I never had war comics in the house as a kid because I knew they would upset mom because her brother died in the Second World War. So that, though, going back and forth, that let me think about the comic in some very specific kinds of ways, but it also let me think about mom and her kind of reaction to those comics that glorified war or anything. Like even Remembrance Day was difficult for her.
Mhm. Now you have obviously all the 2200 comics you said,
Yeah.
but that's not the only outside material that you include. You have a lot of quotes from a variety of books, particularly ones on grief and the process of grieving. Was that reading you were doing independently to kind of help you through the process yourself, or did you find once you'd landed on this project that you started exploring literature or writing in that area, and then started to weave that in a way that it spoke to your process and project?
It was mainly once I landed on grief as being part of this. There was a little bit, I had read The Year of Magical Thinking previously, but most of it I hadn't. Um, a couple things. There's a book called My Autobiography of Carson McCullers, and she was going to write a biography of Carson McCullers, and it ended up being as much about her as about her subject. And she has a line where she says, "Let me tell you about my relationship to the materials." It's not about grief, but that's a quotation I include, and that's actually part of what helped me to get to this form, this idea that there's something behind why we study what we study.
Yeah, the one that I made note of was Nancy K. Miller's Bequest and Betrayal. And
Yeah.
you include a quote that says, reading the memoirs of writers coming to terms with their loss has helped, but also complicated my task. And I have to imagine that you included that to point towards the fact that for yourself, maybe including some of this has complicated things for you.
Yeah, I think so. And it's also the idea that there's no one path to grief, that it's always so complicated, and you never know how it's going to manifest. And so yeah, all these different grief memoirs, they did help me, but they also complicated things because there were times that I read things that were completely outside my experience with how grief operates. But I came to realize that that's okay, that everybody has this different path. So I think it complicated things in a good way for me and made me really realize that it's so idiosyncratic. And the only thing you can say about grief is that it is different for everyone.
Speaking of complicating things, it's something that you write about, but that also, I mean, it just if you're a comic book reader, particularly if you're a superhero comic book reader, continuity and seriality and the like expectations that come with the format and how that matches up to, the expectations that we have as children of our parents, or the like, the life cycle, and that things kind of can get blown up and reset in a comic in a way that they can't in life. And I'm
Yeah.
curious if that's something that you wrestled with or had it like some sense of beforehand as a like big comic book reader and someone who studies this.
It's a really interesting question. Um, I think I came at thinking about Mom's story through that idea that you can change narratives in comics, that, just because something happened doesn't mean it's set in stone, that you can uh, retcon, as they say, retroactively change things, or you can have multiple narratives that branch off. And these, you can have several different worlds where things happened in different ways. And so it was useful as a way to explore the what if of Mom's life. Like she only had a great education because she grew up during the Depression. So I found myself thinking a lot about what if she had been able to finish high school and pursue her interests. And she had this great interest in fashion, and she wasn't able to pursue it. So I found myself thinking about that. Or she was able to finally go to Edmonton to what was called then beauty school, and had to come home to take care, or the story we were always told was it was to take care of a relative who was ill. Now, in working on this book, I heard several different versions of that story, and no one seems to know exactly what happened. But I also found myself thinking, what if she didn't have to come home? Now, I probably wouldn't be here, but how would her life have been different? That process of thinking about a parent outside of the role as a parent was really useful for me. Thinking about her as a person and not just my mom.
Are you also in some way thinking about yourself as, like an alternate version of yourself? Because you do write about how, like, in some ways, writing this is an attempt to, write the eulogy that you couldn't write in the moment, that you were too drowned by your grief at that time to properly convey kind of the message that you wanted to, and that this affords you that opportunity. This is like the sliding doors.
Yeah, I think it is. I really do see this as that eulogy that I couldn't write at the time, that I was, all of us, my three sisters and I, were all too devastated to be able to do the eulogy. So it was my brother-in-law who actually delivered it. So I do see this book as a eulogy. And when the copies of the book came to the house, I remember opening the box and thinking, my God, what would Mom think of her image being on the cover of this academic book? Um, so yeah, it very much was that for me.
Well, speaking of her image, you got someone to basically recreate in comic form a photo of her and a friend. Like, how did you land on that as the image and the notion of not just taking the photograph, but like essentially comicizing your mother?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to include photos and write about the photos. So I talked to my sisters and there were only, I think, 8 photos of mom before she got married. There's almost none left between all of us. So I have copies of them and most of them are in the book. So I was writing about photographs and then I came upon this idea that grief is a palimpsest in that dad dies and then mom dies and then my thesis supervisor died as I was writing this and friends, like it's just they pile on top of one another. And so I had that idea and I also was writing about adaptation in one of the chapters, adapting the Conan stories to comics form. So I decided I wanted to include something that was a palimpsest and an adaptation. And so I thought of Scott Chandler immediately. And so I got Scott to draw um, a version of Mom and her friend Belva. And there's a pencil version and an ink version. And they're included in the book. And then as Michelle Verana was designing the cover, I talked to him about, these images as well. And Scott agreed to their use on the cover as well. And I think Michelle put together a really interesting cover that utilizes those 3 images together and really shows that palimpsest and that adaptation as well.
Mhm. Before we go, because we are running out of time, I want to talk about nostalgia.
Mhm.
You quote Janelle Wilson from her book Nostalgia: The Sanctuary of Meaning, but you also have from an article by Katerina Kalinina on nostalgia, and I'm curious because one of the, I mean, through lines of both of those quotes that you pull from is about either reconstructing or linking the past with the present self, and was that an attempt to do that for your mother or for yourself?
I think it was more for me. Um, so using nostalgia as a tool. So nostalgia can be this place we just go wallow in it. Oh, things were better then. But you can also have this kind of reflective nostalgia where you look to the past in critical and reflective ways in order to think about the present. And I was trying to do that, and specifically as a way to think about not only the comics, but to think about mom as well. So yeah, nostalgia, I think for me in this book was one of the tools that I wanted to use.
The Katerina Kalinina one also says, crucially, the future is part of this connection. Is this
Right.
an attempt to like keep your mom present and push towards like her inclusion in future story?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it is. And it's because I'm from Alberta and her grave's in Alberta, so I can't go visit her grave. And these comic books, these objects sort of have become this thing I can go to. And now this book is something that is going to be there and always there as a way to connect to her.
So on Comics and Grief, it's listed as number one in a series. Is this like an ongoing series from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, or are you doing more on this topic?
No, this is Wilfrid Laurier University Press. It's called Crossing Lines. It's the first book in that series, and it'll be a variety of different approaches to comic studies.
Well, you've certainly exploded the world of comic studies and set the bar pretty high on this one. It was a fascinating read. It comes out, as I said, Wilfrid Laurier University Press. You're celebrating the launch in your hometown of Windsor tonight. Best of luck with that, and thanks very much for joining me on the show to talk about it, Dale.
Thanks very much, Michael.